Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here in this company. I'm trained as a historian of the early modern world and of the Reformation more generally in the 16th, 17th centuries, that period with that defining split within Christianity. I work primarily in the Scottish Reformation with those communities that eventually came to be known as Presbyterians. The early modern world, I think, can tell us a lot about our own society, about history, and about how we relate to the people or the ideas of the past. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what history can tell us about Christianity in that period, about how some of the reformers considered history, and then hopefully a little bit about my own research, sometimes that I call the Reformation of time, to indicate how everyday lives were changed with the onset of the Reformation, and how maybe these changes can be a bridge for understanding different religious traditions. Yes. Studying history, of course, is a form of dialogue in itself. We speak to the past by bringing aspects of ourselves, our own understandings of the world, how it should or does operate, our ideas or conceptions about God into our studies. We're changed by our understandings of the past, and if we do history well, we can give those interested a fulsome understanding of the past. Now, some people, usually those who haven't studied history very carefully, consider it almost impossible to do history well and seem to think that this dialogue would be almost impossible. They'll say things like, we're all biased. The winners write the history, and they almost, in these words, almost dismiss history as almost an insurmountable problem. But these people, I think, do a disservice to the carefulness that is at the heart of modern scholarly analysis, at least of the past. Sure, we all have some biases, of course, and it's important to take account of these power imbalances in history, but we can do it, and it's part of the job of doing history well, is having the self-awareness to recognize our own assumptions, our own biases, and then kind of park them over there as we try to do our best to understand the past on its own terms. So history, when done well, is actually a conversation with the past that is not fundamentally concerned with the present. So for a long time, historians of every tradition had a hard time examining the past objectively because they were so devoted to their own traditions that they found it difficult to move beyond what they thought about the incorrectness of one religious community or the correctness of their own. Protestants and Catholics alike became what we now call confessional historians, in that they failed to really try to understand from the perspective of another tradition. The narratives of confessional history created, that the confessional historians created, remain present, but its practice is largely gone from the world of academic history. And it's gone because it wasn't accurate. And modern historians would be more interested in the accuracy than they are with promoting a particular religious tradition. Now, historical accuracy was not necessarily at the heart of the analysis provided by many of the 16th century reformers who moonlighted as historians. And they, of course, knew that creating historical narratives was important, but they were open usually to only focusing on the parts that they liked. And especially, they usually were the parts that included them. So the example I know best is that of John Knox, whose life has become synonymous with the Scottish Reformation. Knox's history of the Reformation only devotes about 4 pages to the entire Christian history of pre-Reformation Scotland. In his history, there's a real sense that the Reformation represents a turning of the page in history, that God had intervened into the mundane lives of everyday Scottish Christians to provide a better way forward. In this context, the Catholic past was not very relevant. It's just the past. On with the future. And it reminds me of my barber that I used to have when I was in graduate school. He would ask me what I studied every single time. What do you study? What do you study? And I would say, history. And he would, oh, he's so angry. And he would say, you should study the future. I said, what do you want from me? I would wonder. So, history, in this case, was a tool for Knox. It was a tool for conveying one way in opposition to another. And for Knox, it told the story of God's deliverance of a group of people from particularly Mary, Queen of Scots, whom you can see him yelling at right there, and other Catholic monarchs. So the discipline of history is now increasingly cross-confessional. Historians try to look at multiple religious traditions, and those trenches of Protestant and Catholic have usually fallen away in terms of, or in favor of a more balanced approach. And from my perspective, this balance liberates the dynamism of religious life, especially religious life in this period. And careful studies of history have shown that the boundaries between these groups are are more permeable than we once thought them to be. We are now able to embrace these gray areas a little bit more. So things that were mostly or marginally Protestant or kind of a little bit maybe Catholic can now be understood alongside these hardline positions that we all know so well. And these gray areas are where a number of the best ideas about understanding other Christian communities can come from. In history, these gray areas are commonly occupied by regular people, not theologians and not famous reformers. And it's here that we can find people sorting out their religious experience, and they're usually sorting out their religious experience in combination with their economic experience or their political experience or their social experience or their family life. One way in which I look for the diversity of the lived religious experience is through investigating how people spend and conceive of their time. And time is, of course, one of our primary concerns in the present day. It's the basic unit of the historian's work. We always seem to want more of it. We're careful to warn against wasting it. We have to keep within 10 minutes. And it's difficult to imagine life here in modern North America outside of measurements of time. And the most striking way in which the Reformation changed time for everyday Scottish Christian was in the massive expansion of the preaching schedule for everyday Christians. Preaching was more of a priority in the Reformed tradition than it was in the Catholic tradition, so it led to an expansion of how many hours people had to spend in church. In Glasgow, for example, there was preaching in the town every Sunday, but in addition to that, every Wednesday and every Friday. And the Sunday preaching could take up to 3 hours. And Wednesday and Friday were designed to be 1 hour, but they frequently were not 1 hour. And there were all kinds of complaints from people in the congregation that the minister kept going over the hour. And then these warnings from the Kirk session, please stay within the hour. And I show there this hourglass. And there's these famous scenes in the Scottish Reformation where they'd have the hourglass there, and you can just imagine the congregation watching it go down and down. And then they'd get to the end, and the guy would just flip and start, and he would start all over again for the second hour. You thought that was it, but no. And the same thing can be found in other Scottish towns, Perth, St. Andrews, other places. And in the pre-Reformation Catholic Church, a regular townsperson would only be expected to be in church on Sunday, and even then, it was more of an ideal. There wouldn't be an hour, and no one was taking attendance, and you weren't going to be fined if you didn't show up. In the new system, it's just a basic mandatory attendance at these events, maybe 9-10 hours for every single Christian. If you were elder in this church, 20 hours. You know, these are all hours that you used to spend doing something else, and now you spend them in your church. So there are also significant changes to the liturgical calendar, to the banning of Catholic saint days, all these local celebrations that were attached to these things. And we don't have enough time to get into that, but needless to say, people attach value to these events. And so the removal was met with some resistance by people in this period. So one thing that strikes me when I investigate time and religion is how busy these early modern people were. They were always turning up late for things. They always wanted to work on the Sabbath day, even though it was illegal. They whined about long sermons, all these kind of things. And we have a tendency to think that because we are busy, that we are the only people who have ever been busy. And that because our lives are complicated, that our lives are, supremely more complicated than other people's lives. And obviously this was not the case. And when we investigate Christianity across confessional boundaries, we can see how people might be differently busy, right? Differently complicated in a Catholic context or a Protestant context. And when we see this, we can learn that about the theological or social ideas that inspired these rules or inspired these changes and the departures that they created from an old religion to a new one. It also helps avoid that dangerous enemy of history, nostalgia, and when we fail to accurately assess the past in favor of easier answers that seem to make more sense to us right away. And the divergences between Christian communities that happened in the Reformation were serious business, and they require serious analysis. And when it comes to understanding Christian communities in this or in any period, seeing is not believing. And learning about these things doesn't demand in any way that we reject our own faith communities. History builds camaraderie with people of the past. And if it can do that, of course, it can help build camaraderie with people in the present. And history is also a particularly powerful tool for understanding how institutions, even massive institutions like the Christian churches, can change over time. How seemingly intractable dispositions on the part of churches could almost be entirely reversed as churches respond to their communities or their new contexts. In this way, history provides not only a tool then for understanding, but also maybe the bedrock for actual dialogue. Thanks very much.